If you were to look at a map of the world, the Taiwan Strait appears as a mere sliver of blue, just 110 miles wide. But in January 2026, this narrow body of water has become the most dangerous friction point on the planet. It is the place where the red lines of the world's two most powerful nations are currently colliding. On one side, you have the People's Republic of China, which has made the reunification of Taiwan its ultimate national priority, a line in the sand that they claim is non-negotiable. On the other side, you have the United States, which has just authorized an $11.1 billion arms package, one of the largest in history, and is currently surging its naval power and long-range missile forces into the region to prevent a shift in the global balance of power. The shocking reality of this moment is that we are no longer talking about deterrence in the abstract. We are talking about the physical movement of the USS Finn, the coordination of massive missile forces aimed at the Chinese industrial heartland, and a Taiwan that is quite literally on edge as the shadow of a global conflict looms larger than ever before. This is the story of how US naval power and advanced missile technology are closing in on China's red line, and why 2026 has become the year that could decide the fate of the 21st century. To understand the tension, we have to look at the January 2026 surge and the USS Finn transit. On January 17, 2026, the guided missile destroyer USS Finn conducted the first Taiwan Strait transit of the year. In Washington, this was described as a routine freedom of navigation operation, but in Beijing, it was viewed as a deliberate provocation. The shocking part of this transit was not just the ship itself, but the timing. It occurred just weeks after the US announced its massive new arms deal with Taipei. The US isn't just sending weapons, it is sending a message of forward presence. By sailing a destroyer through the strait while China is conducting sustained, large-scale drills, the US is effectively daring the PLA to blink. The vulnerability is not the strength of the destroyer, it's the fact that in the narrow strait, a single miscalculation by a radar operator could turn a routine transit into a hot war. This leads us to the missile coordination and the industrial heartland threat. One of the most shocking developments in late January 2026 is the report that the US military is now coordinating large missile forces on and around Taiwan. These aren't just defensive surface-to-air batteries. These are long-range precision systems capable of reaching the Chinese industrial heartland. The shocking strategy here is asymmetric counterstrike. The US and Taiwan are signaling to Beijing that any invasion of the island would not be confined to the beaches. It would result in a devastating strike on the economic engines of the mainland. For China, this is the ultimate red line. They view Taiwan as a domestic issue, but the presence of US coordinated missiles on the island turns it into a permanent, high-tech dagger pointed at the heart of the CCP's power. The vulnerability is not the accuracy of the missiles, it's the fact that the deterrence is now built on the threat of total economic destruction for both sides. Now let's talk about the sustained coercion and the erosion of the buffer. In early 2026, China shifted its tactics. They moved away from periodic exercises to what analysts call sustained large-scale drills. The PLA is no longer just practicing for an invasion. They are creating a new normal, where Chinese warships and jets are constantly crossing the median line of the strait. The shocking goal of this strategy is to erode the buffer. By making military tension a daily occurrence, China is trying to desensitize the world and exhaust Taiwan's defense forces. They want to reach a point where a real invasion looks exactly like just another drill. Taiwan is on edge because they have to treat every one of these drills as the real thing. The shocking reality is that the Taiwanese Air Force is being flown into the ground, and their sailors are spending more time at sea than ever before, just to maintain a presence in their own waters. The vulnerability is not the lack of equipment, it's the fatigue of vigilance that China is trying to weaponize. This brings us to the 2026 National Defense Strategy, NDS, and the Pacific Resolve. The 2026 U.S. National Defense Strategy has made one thing very clear. The U.S. views the prevention of PRC dominance in the Indo-Pacific as its primary economic and security interest. The shocking shift in the NDS is the emphasis on realistic diplomacy combined with de-escalation. This sounds peaceful, but in military terms, it means the US is preparing for a long-haul confrontation. They are setting up a Northeast Asia command to streamline their response to Chinese maneuvers. The shocking truth is that the US is no longer trying to avoid a confrontation. They are trying to manage it. They are building a permanent infrastructure for a potential war, which in itself is a massive escalation of the red line dynamics. The vulnerability is not the lack of diplomacy, it's the fact that both sides are preparing for a war that they both claim they want to avoid. Now consider the legal weaponization and the European pressure. While the ships and missiles move in the Pacific, a shocking diplomatic war is happening in Europe. In January 2026, reports emerged that China is using dubious legal claims to pressure European governments into blocking Taiwanese politicians. The shocking part of this strategy is that China is trying to internationally isolate Taiwan before a single shot is fired. They are telling the world, if you recognize Taiwan, you are breaking international law. This is part of the red line. China wants to make the cost of supporting Taiwan so high, legally, economically, and politically, that the US finds itself standing alone. If the US is the only country willing to cross the red line, the deterrent becomes much weaker. The vulnerability is not the lack of allies, it's the legal fog that China is creating to slow down the international response to a crisis. Let's look deeper into the $11.1 billion gamble. The arms deal approved in late 2025 and implemented in early 2026 is a shocking injection of high-tech power into the island. It includes advanced drones, anti-ship missiles, and electronic warfare suites. But the shocking reality is that these weapons take years to integrate. Taiwan is in a window of vulnerability. They have the promise of future power, but right now they are facing a Chinese military that is at the peak of its modernization. The shocking risk of 2026 is that China might decide to act before these new US weapons are fully operational. The arms deal, meant to deter war, might actually be the very thing that accelerates the timeline for conflict. The vulnerability is not the quality of the weapons, it's the timing gap between the deal and the deployment. And then there is the internal Taiwanese calculus. How does a society live on edge for decades? In 2026, the internal pressure in Taiwan is reaching a boiling point. With a new leadership elected in 2024 and a population that is increasingly divided on how to handle Beijing, the island's domestic stability is its own red line. The shocking reality is that China is using cognitive warfare to convince the Taiwanese people that the US will eventually abandon them. They point to the chaos in Washington and the economic interests of the US to sow doubt. If the people of Taiwan lose faith in the US deterrent, the red line effectively disappears. The shocking battle of 2026 is not just for the Strait, but for the hearts and minds of the people living on the island. The vulnerability is not the lack of patriotism. It's the psychological attrition of living under a constant threat of annihilation. Finally, we have to talk about the end game of the red line. As US naval power and missiles close in on the Taiwan Strait and China continues its sustained coercion, the world is waiting for a spark. The shocking conclusion of January 2026 is that the era of strategic ambiguity is over. The US is now being forced to be strategically clear. By surging its fleet and coordinating its missiles, Washington is telling Beijing, this is our red line, and we are prepared to fight for it. But Beijing's response is equally clear, this is our territory and we are prepared to die for it. So why is this moment so shocking? Because it shows that the global order is being tested in a way it hasn't been since 1945. The Taiwan Strait is not just a body of water, it is the geopolitical center of gravity for the entire world. The transit of the USS Finn, the coordination of the missiles, and the high alert in Taipei are not just news stories. They are the early warning signs of a world that is losing its ability to manage conflict. The next time you see a headline about a US destroyer in the Taiwan Strait, don't just think about the ship. Think about the missile forces in the mountains. Think about the sustained drills on the coast. Think about the red line. Because in 2026, the distance between deterrence and catastrophe is no more than the 110 miles of water that separates Taiwan from the mainland. The US surges its power because it believes it must maintain the peace. China monitors the transit because it believes it must defend its honor. And Taiwan remains on edge because they know that in a war between giants, they are the ones who will pay the ultimate price.